So welcome everyone to the second webinar that we're running in collaboration with AVA Project. This one is focusing on developing a step-by-step approach to digital safeguarding. If you didn't make the first webinar, you can watch the video after today, which we've posted recently on our blog. In terms of the session today, we do try and make sure that we can make our information as accessible as possible. So we aim to have images with descriptions. We've got live captioning on today's webinar. To access that, what you need to do at the bottom of your Zoom screen is click the three dots, which underneath say more, and you'll get an option at the very bottom to select live on custom live streaming service. If you've got any questions, just let me know in the chat. I'll also put those instructions into chat as well. And that means that you'll get captions on your screen. Those are live captions, so they are pretty good, but they're not exactly sometimes what the presenter is saying. We aim to give clear and clean presentations and good video and audio quality. And that's a good time for me to mention that today's session is being recorded. If you're new to the webinar format, just so you know, we can't see you, but you can share chat in the chat function within the webinar, and we'll be keeping an eye out for any questions that might crop up there. I think that's everything from me. For those of you that have just joined, we would welcome you to complete the pre-survey, which I'm going to post again in the chat. And I'll hand over to Ava and Ellie at Ava Project to take us forward. Thank you.
So afternoon, everyone. So this is the second of our series on digital safeguarding. So the first one was kind of giving you a broad overview, and this one we're kind of looking more of a kind of step-to-step guide about how you kind of start with a policy and look at safeguarding as you go along. So the first thing we're going to do is do a quick review of the principles of digital safeguarding, then look at how to build a digital safeguarding policy, looking at how you assess the risks, and then applying how you kind of go about applying those principles across all your digital work, and then how you kind of start that by designing for safety across different types of digital. And then last, we will look again at kind of well-being and confidence in digital safeguarding for your team. So first things first, it's the principles of digital safeguarding. So again, the first thing we always say is that the principles are exactly the same as doing safeguarding face-to-face. So many of you will be really aware of them. It's just about kind of thinking about the additional considerations you might need to do when you're in digital spaces. And the key thing to remember is that all of them are mainly outlined in the CARE Act, and those completely still apply to all your digital work. So the first thing is looking at the kind of underpinning of the digital safeguarding. So this is what you need to know in terms of your legal obligations, but also making sure that all of your clients are safe. But we also kind of take a trauma-informed approach to all our digital spaces. So kind of a bit more of an enhanced approach around how you kind of keep people safe within these spaces. And it's important to note that this work, when you talk about digital safeguarding, crosses all forms of digital. So whether you're talking about kind of emails or blogs, but also to kind of games and kind of Zoom calls and things like that. So firstly, just a little recap on the 6 principles of digital safeguarding outlined in the CARE Act. So the first one is about empowerment. So it's about making sure that you have a group of people that feel empowered doing your work instead of feeling like they're being told to do things. Protection, so again looking at the kind of different vulnerabilities that people have and what you need to put in place. Also prevention, so making sure that you're kind of doing assessments as you go so you can mitigate as much as possible. Then proportionality, and this is really important, which is all the risks will be very different depending on the circumstances, and what any actions that you need to take need to be proportionate to what the risks are. So that's really important to keep in mind. And then partnership. So again, we very much take the view that safeguarding should never sit with one individual or one organization. It's something that we all share about keeping everyone safe, whether that's children or vulnerable adults or just sort of general people. So again, it's making sure that you kind of have systems in place that you know who to go to and who to signpost to and things like that. And the last one is accountability. Now, this one's really important about making sure you're very transparent and honest about how you go about things and how you've made decisions. So again, if something happens and someone does either suffer abuse or neglect, you know what principles you took by and you're very open and transparent with that. So then going on to what we would call kind of our kind of framework around what digital safeguarding is. And that's very important to kind of, we've taken this from the Girl Effects digital safeguarding resource, which is a really good one. Again, that kind of be sent to you all later and is also in the resource pack. So the first thing to consider is around data security. So this is very much what GDPR is about. So it's about making sure that any data that you collect is kept in a secure way, whether that's, so it's not vulnerable to, let's say, outside interference, or that it's lost or damaged or anything like that. So again, it's really important when you consider about security is that in Europe, it's under GDPR laws, but in different contexts around the world, it will be under different laws. So again, if you're working in different territories, it's really good to kind of have a little look about what their data security laws say. The next part is very much thinking, thinking around data privacy. So this isn't just about how you store data and making it, keeping it secure. It's about making sure that the data that you process or collect is kept confidentially, that everyone is very honest and transparent about why you're using it, why you need it, and also kind of thinking about whether you do need to collect that data, especially when you're talking about people's kind of private information. And then again, what we would say is those two kind of sit at the heart of this. And then around that, you have the digital safeguarding principles. And then beyond that, you also have kind of the ethics. And that really depends on kind of the organization you work for, what their values and principles are. And that kind of will underpin all of this work. And then lastly, a quick kind of recap on the trauma-informed stuff that you would have got with the pre-video. So again, it's very much about kind of a user-centered approach. So making sure the person that you are trying to reach is at the center of everything you do, with an overlay of understanding what trauma is, but also kind of issues around intersectionality. So first things first, we always suggest that you start with a policy. And this is really important because everyone has a duty of care to both their beneficiaries, their users, and making sure that they're not just safe, but also the kind of their well-being is put in place. And a policy is a really good way of kind of having a shared understanding and foundation of that. What I would say is that you don't need a separate digital safeguarding policy. It can be integrated into your current policy. Again, it's good to kind of review your safeguarding policy sort of yearly anyway, to make sure that you're kind of dealing with any kind of risks that may have occurred over that year. But with this, it's just about kind of integrating it into your current systems. So the first thing is about making sure that you have a clear understanding of the kind of legal frameworks and the legislation frameworks that you will be abiding by. So again, the CARE Act, GDPR, but also additional ones if you're working with children. Again, they're all sort of set out in the resource pack, and we kind of went through them in quite a lot of detail in the last session. And then it's also about creating a shared understanding with all your kind of staff, your employees, whether that's throughout your whole organization. And that, again, would be embedded with your organization's kind of beliefs around how they protect vulnerable users, especially around kind of intersectionality and accessibility and things like that. What's also really important is that you have a clear lead. So everyone in the organization knows where to go to if there's an incident that happens, or they just need some advice. And again, that should be really stated clearly within your policy. And again, it shouldn't be one individual. There could be a lead, but they have a kind of resource to go to. So whether it's someone on the board, a senior manager, or someone external. So again, it's about sharing those risks. There are lots of different templates available that you can use, and you can find them on our DigiSafe site, which is a really good way of kind of going through a step-by-step guide. And a lot of the content I'll be giving you today is based on the DigiSafe tool. And then it's really important to remember that with any kind of new policy, you need to make sure that your staff and volunteers are trained and have buy-in to it, so everyone feels confident using it. So any questions they might have, they have a chance to do that at the start. So the next step is about how once you've created that policy, how you put that into practice. So, you know, policy is always a good starting point, but it's not something that sits on a shelf and isn't kind of a dynamic document. So again, it's really important that it's viewed as kind of a live, ongoing process. So again, it's really important to remember with safeguarding, you can never mitigate all forms of risk. But it's also to remember that because there's a risk, that shouldn't be a barrier for you to do the work. It should be more of a thinking about it, what measures you can put in place, and what you need to think about. And again, within that, it's also thinking about, you know, making sure that there's really accessible information, and that you constantly remind people of it. So things of, you know, having shared documents on your drive that people can link to, whether it's having posters in the buildings and things like that you operate in. I know that's not so relevant these days, but it might be going forward. But again, it's just making sure that everyone has easy access to that individual. So if anyone has any concerns, they know exactly what to do. So in part, taking that on board, the next thing to consider that's within your policy is thinking about the pathways, that if there was an incident, what would happen next? So again, it's completely impossible to consider every sort of risk that can arise in an online space. The same with kind of face-to-face learning, but there are things that you can kind of make sure you mitigate. And again, creating those pathways, again, creates that confidence and understanding that that risk doesn't hold with one individual that might have become aware of something that they're concerned about. It's shared amongst people. So as you can see from this diagram, you know, someone notices an incident, the first thing they need to make sure they do is they write everything down, and that's maybe have templates within your policy that says, you know, this is kind of how you would lay things out. So it might be, what's the risk? What have you noticed? What are your concerns? What conversations you've had with the individual. The first thing they need to do is assess whether they're at risk of significant harm immediately. And if you think that they are, the first thing they need to do is encourage them to simply ring 999. They can offer to do that on their behalf. If they're unwilling to do so, that there's only so much you can do in that situation. Again, it's a little bit different if you have information around who they are, especially if they're children. Again, you might want to escalate that, but that wouldn't necessarily sit with the decision of the individual that's noticed the risk. That would again be escalating. As you see, all that information is getting passed on to the safeguarding leads or team, and they will make those decisions about what action is appropriate. And again, thinking about that proportionality, every single risk and situation will be different. So again, they're the ones that will sit and hold that and kind of work out what action they can take. And once they've done that, they will implement it, whether that's kind of contacting safeguarding leads in their local authority, whether that's kind of going back to the individual and doing a bit more search, or kind of looking at how we can mitigate things going forward, which is quite common in a digital space, especially if you kind of think about anonymity and things like that. So that's kind of the whistle tour about how you kind of think about putting the process together. Now I want to kind of go on to looking at how you assess the risks. So what you should do when you sort of set up your any kind of digital problem is really think about what the risks are, whether that's online services with different tools, all of that things. And when you start designing and putting together how you're going to do that service, is to make sure kind of at each point to kind of assess each risk by writing them down and then kind of doing this very, very systematically. And again, what's really important is taking quite a proactive approach to this. As I said, risks can change, new ones can emerge depending on what's going on. If we think of the last year, you know, if we say to each other a year ago what we thought the risks were in our organizations and how we support people, they're completely different now, mainly because lots of people have had to move into digital spaces, the risk of social distance, you know, all of that sort of thing. So it's again really important that you have a kind of very proactive but also live document. You can think of quite general risks and also really specific ones, and you can kind of break them down. And what's really important is that you have a way of tracking them that you all feel comfortable doing. So when you think about risks online, they really kind of start with asking yourself some very specific questions about, so what are the risks, not just to the individual using the product, but also to you as an organization and the individuals that maybe be delivering it? And what are the safeguarding needs that you've already put in place? Are people confident using them? All of those sort of things. And then what additional safety measures you might need, and note them down. And usually when it comes to digital safeguarding, they come across in sort of 3 different categories. So the content, so that's very much about what you're presenting. So is the information accurate? Could it be harmful? Could it be triggering? What is it, making sure that it's everything, the information you're giving is in a legal context? And this is also about making sure that you kind of have the content that establishes clear rules for users and how you would address any kind of inappropriate content that's posted. Very much if you think about things like forums, if you don't have them moderated, making clear what would happen if someone put something inappropriate on. So again, it's just writing them all down around the content and what you want to achieve. The next one is around contact. So what is the dynamic in your digital service? So if it's a Zoom call, the contact would be doing, first of all, having the actual Zoom call, but it might also be, what do you do beforehand? You know, what are your referral pathways? What checks are done with that? What you do afterwards? What is the contact? Who's contacting who? So again, making sure that anyone that's got that position, that's running maybe group sessions or one-to-one sessions, have DBS checks, that you've done all of those due diligence. And again, that you have a mechanism that if any kind of issue arises, that you can report that really simply. So again, making that really, really clear in any kind of product that you have. So it might be having an email address that you can make reports to anonymously or straight to the CEO or things like that. So again, it's making sure that people have lots of pathways to report any issues that they may have. And the last one is around conduct. So this relates to how people behave online. So it can include things like trolling, online abuse. And again, it's very important that you just have clear guidelines and policies around escalation so that it kind of feeds into the other two, especially in terms of contact. So again, the kind of reporting thing. What we suggest at this point is that you kind of develop a matrix that kind of outlines all the risks you've identified, what measures you've put in place, and what kind of level of risk it is, because I think that's really important to say. You know, some risks might be really, really likely, but actually the effect that they have in terms of harm is quite low. So again, it's kind of making those judgments. So again, when you're assessing of these risks, it's really important they kind of mainly fall into these 3 categories. So information security in a digital space, you know, what systems have you got in place to make sure that the data that you're collecting, the information people are providing you is secure. And this isn't just about what you collect as an individual, but it's also about an individual and an organization. It's also very much about what third-party tools you use. So if you're using Zoom, making sure that you know where they store their data, who can add that, you know, is it password protected? All of those same things. Same, you know, with any kind of tool, using survey tools or you know, particular website tools and things like that. And they will always be available, or they should always be available in the terms and conditions. And it's always a good piece of advice to kind of have a little look through that before you kind of make a decision and going ahead and taking that on. And then kind of going a step further on that is about privacy and consent. So again, making sure you're respecting people's privacy and allowing them to have choice about how they want to engage things. So this is very much looking at kind of what opt-down systems you have, what kind of choices they can make if they don't, let's say they don't want to kind of give you particular parts of information on this platform. Again, giving them really, really clear information so that they can opt in to what they do. And it's really important at this point to be really, really transparent. So, you know, having privacy policies on your website and things like that. So again, it's just being very open with people. And then there's the part of the delivery and practice. So again, we'll look at this in more detail, but those are the kind of individual risks to the service or support that you're trying to provide, and looking at them. And when this part of it's really important to kind of think about how you can design for safety from the onset of what you're trying to create, whether that's if you're creating something from scratch or if you're adapting new services. And we always kind of say that there's also a fourth one, which is about how you support people in risk of harm. And you know your beneficiaries and what risks what additional risks or vulnerabilities they have. So again, thinking about those in a digital context, you know, what happens if they disclose, what the process is, but also thinking about their digital confidence, what kind of hardware they use. Do they have access to the internet? So really thinking about that kind of individual and what kind of systems and support you can put in place to kind of help them be as safe as possible in an online context, but also as comfortable as possible in terms of their well-being. So in terms of the assessing risk, once you've kind of looked through this, you've established each risk, what you need to do is look at them in terms of the likelihood they happen, the impact of what happens, and from those two, you can then have a risk rate. So a number that kind of can be compared to other ones. So again, it kind of helps you what you do. Looking at each individual ones, looking at what controls you have to kind of prevent them and what you can do to mitigate them. Being really clear about whose responsibility they are. So again, you know, depending on your organization and how they're structured. So if something goes wrong in a volunteer setting, you know, whose responsibility is it to manage that versus whether, let's say, it's something to do with HR or content on your website. So again, it's just having a clear lead so everyone knows and everyone's clear on that one. The next one is about, once you've kind of put all of that together, looking at that risk and go, is that an acceptable risk that we take of the benefit that you would get? Again, it's not looking at it as like, oh, that's too risky, it's a barrier. It's kind of going, are there measures enough that we can mitigate it so we can go forward? So it's again, making those judgments. And again, you're probably all very used to doing that when working with beneficiaries kind of in a frontline context. We do that every day. It's no different in a digital context. And then if within assessing that risks, you kind of go through that, you might have said, for instance, what you're going to do to mitigate it. It's really important that you then note down what actions you have taken. So again, it's about making sure that it is kind of a live document, so it doesn't sort of sit on the shelf, that you always kind of renew it as you go along and things happen. And again, it's very useful to kind of, when you kind of put in this process, is to have a feedback loop. So it's a natural process that it happens whenever something happens. And the last thing to remember is that one really important thing with all of this is that you just record everything, why you've taken those decisions, your rationale for it. So again, it's just making sure that you have that body of evidence and you've got a rationale behind something so that it's not on that individual. So again, we suggest there's lots of templates out there that kind of create a risk assessment matrix. I've put a link, but there's also some more, and they're really some in the resource pack, and also DigiSafe has lots of various resources there, and it's a really good kind of template. You can do it. And as you can see, you kind of put in the potential risk, then you kind of make sure you kind of put a likelihood, the severity of the risk, and that's where you kind of make the judgment, and then what measures you put in place. So once you've done all of that, it's about implementing your assessment. So again, you have a document, you've made those decisions, you've gone through them, you've described your approach, and then you've got a mechanism to do this. So again, it's making sure that, I have got a little lost here. There. And again, what you need to do, it's very important that you do it for each one. So again, it's all written down and that you've got sign off from both your senior managers and your board in this context. So again, making sure these documents maybe are reviewed once a year by your board, and also that if there is an incident, that there's a clear designated person on your board to call on if you need support. So what we suggest should also include use and why you've used them and how you use them in your work, what staff are involved in this, and how they've mitigated the risks and how you've mitigated risks of sort of inappropriate behaviour, guidance and support for all your staff about how to do this, and these all should be linked up to also your GDPR and privacy policy. And again, as I said before, review process should always kind of be built in, and do it as early as possible. So if your protocol says that you've got a plan B and this platform and it doesn't work out, you can then go forward in your plan C and so on. And kind of revisiting this register as part of your kind of service design as much as possible. And so that kind of planning always evolves. So very much we're kind of going into how you apply the principles, and we'll look at designing for safety later on. And that's kind of how you think about it. So when you kind of start building, we always kind of take an iterative process. You start with an idea, you kind of build on that, and you can ask these questions and assess the risks at each stage. So going on to how you apply the principles. So whether you're creating a new service or adapting an old one or taking an offline service into an online space, you'll be carrying out a process of design. So you'll be thinking and planning out how you do this. So this guide won't show you exactly how to do, like I won't be explaining exactly how to do it in each circumstances, but it will give you kind of an overarching view of the kind of principles that you need to think about at each term. So again, we're really thinking about sort of the main universal ones, but there's a lot of guidance out there. And as I said, looking on DigiSpace and DigiSafe, sorry, and the resource, there's lots of kind of more in-depth ideas around that. And this will also, so the first thing we say is that you need to think about designing for online behavior, because there are some very different habits that us humans have, whether we're interacting in a face-to-face context or in a digital space. And I think we've probably all become aware of that over the last year. And quite a lot of this is to do with how we kind of view social inhibitors, and quite a lot of the time they're loosened in an online space. And that doesn't actually necessarily matter if they're anonymous or not. But anonymity in a digital space is something that you really need to kind of think about when you go, really think about when you're kind of designing these things. So the first thing we talk about is the online disinhibition effect. And this is what often leads to people kind of trolling or bullying or saying things that you think that's really out of context for them. And it's because it's that kind of, we always describe it, it's like screaming in a car. You don't really think that anyone can see or hear you, but they can. So again, that happens quite a lot in a digital space. And there's again some more information and articles around that in the resource pack. The other thing to think about is that you don't have access the same kind of feeling about people's facial cues or body language, whether that's there because you're not seeing it because you've got a chat function or people are sending you emails, but it's also harder to tell them if you're doing it on an online call. You also might people might be asking to do it so that they turn the video off and things like that. So again, just remember that it's harder to do things, so kind of putting things in place around how you're going to kind of mitigate that. So maybe ask a few more questions, give a bit more time at the beginning, at the end, those sort of things. So the next one is looking at the digital divide or digital confidence. So this is really looking about how comfortable people are about using, whether it's a new tool or even getting online. So really thinking about here, who are your users and what challenges they might have or what barriers they might have to accessing services online. So, you know, over the last year, that's become really apparent around sort of homeschooling, that not, you know, a lot of families will only have like a tablet or one phone that they can access the internet on. They might not be able to have super fast broadband. They're only using kind of the data on their phone. So again, thinking about that, but then also thinking about digital confidence. So that can make a huge effect on how how people react to asking them to do things. So if you're introducing a new tool or a new format, it's always, again, really important to just sort of thinking about making sure what information you've given them. Have you given them a little bit of time to test it out so they feel confident, so then when we go into that space, they can get the most out of it. Again, we've touched on this a little bit, but the online spaces are often and quite a lot and very easy to do to hide someone's identity, whether that is because it's designed that way, or it's because, you know, the checks that you might do to make sure that the person you say they are, the person that they say they are, is the person they are. So again, really thinking about what kind of service you do you need to make those checks before, and how would you do that? And it can be really hard, especially when kind of delivering support to people in crisis where you don't have access to that information. So if they kind of disclose something or say something to you that goes, I'm really, really concerned about that, there are limitations in how so much you can do if they're anonymous. And you've got to be able to find a way that you can hold that risk and reassure that individual that might have got that disclosure. So again, just really thinking about those things through. And the last one is looking about where they're located. So, you know, we've all had kind of that work home life blurred, and that's the same for our service users. You know, before they might be going out somewhere, getting support in a space that doesn't feel like their sanctuary. So a lot of people might have a safe space at home where they don't want that to interfere with it. So again, thinking about that, or it might be not, you know, it might not be feasibly possible because, you know, there's kids running around or things like that, but also thinking about, is it safe in their home? So that's something that we're really, you know, got to think about. How do you create those contraventional spaces? So, you know, you see the person in front of you, but you don't know what's going on behind the screen, or things like that. So again, having those conversations with people about making sure that they can find somewhere where they feel safe and confident and private. So again, about asking them whether it's kind of before you do sessions or through the process. So again, it's really kind of thinking about where they're located and what advice you can give to people. So the next one is designing for safety. So again, really making sure, so privacy is about the user's ability to control the information that you have about themselves, and maintaining that privacy is really important to keep users safe. Because if their personal information is revealed, that could put them at really high risk, but also make them feel like they don't want to participate in something that could be really beneficial for them. So again, thinking about what information you actually need to provide that service. You know, do you need their address or their contact numbers? Can you just have a name? All of those things. And it's very, very important that you're very clear and transparent about that, and also respect the boundaries of that individual. Ask for consent and be transparent about it is also very key. So that nicely moves on to the importance of consent, which is very clearly laid out under GDPR laws. Again, best practice is always an opt-in system and not an opt-out system, making sure you look really clear and simple language. You're not trying to trick anyone to say yes, you know, simple, plain English. And also make it engaging. So, you know, again, none of us really like trolling through pages and pages of terms and conditions. So make it in a way that you go, it's quick and easy, and you might find extra information. So kind of thinking about the design of it, things like that. And the last one is, in some situations, you might have to do a DPA. It's not always needed, but especially if you're working with children, it is something that you need to do. And again, making sure that that's an engaging process as much as possible, so that they engage with it and they understand what's going on, and that you get kind of the most out of it. Next is around the security element. Again, this is very much under GDPR. The key things to this, making sure all your staff are trained on security and know the most common risk to data, even in an online space, is human error. So again, making sure that, you know, your staff have a really clear understanding of it, that you review your internal measures. If something happens, you look at them, what other things can you put in place, making sure that you check all your third-party tools. And it's things that's an often one we forget, that there's a risk involved in processing information with something that you don't have control with. So again, just doing that kind of due diligence checks, you know, where their servers are kept, how they store their, do they share it with anyone else? Is there opt-outs and opt-in? So again, just kind of doing that research beforehand. And kind of reviewing who has access to that data. So I think that is a really interesting one. You know, everyone has staff turnover, different teams and different things. So it's okay to limit that information to only the people that need to have it. And again, really important in all of this is just kind of thinking about internal security. So looking at virus protection, making sure that you've kind of invested in that so that you all feel confident doing it, so that kind of the mitigating the risks of kind of external attacks on things like that. Okay, and so the last one we always say is designing for accessibility. So to make your services usable for as many people as possible, we need to look at what additional things that you can do to make it accessible possible. And that helps reduce the risks of people finding the wrong information or the struggle, or that becomes triggering the whole process of using things. So again, considering that when you start the design process. So thinking about, you know, age, race, ethnicity, sexuality, religion, all of those things, but again, kind of twin that with the kind of digital access issues we were talking about before. So again, you know, accessible kind of designs, inclusive languages, images, and additional features. So, you know, there's lots of kind of plugins you can use on websites and things like that that can create additional principles. You know, think about today, we've got a plugin that allows captions, and that can be turned on and off. So thinking about those things and how you would go about doing them. Again, kind of going back to that digital divide issue around how some people have more access to technology, more data, you know, all of those sort of things. So again, thinking about, you know, well, why you're going around this particular route. So I think, you know, the example that we always give is looking at things like, if you're looking at designing a new website on app, why is it an app or website? How are people actually going to access it? So if you're looking at people that might not have access to a smartphone, is it better to kind of do it as a normal website? So again, just kind of thinking those things through in a really clear way. And the last thing I would say is less is more. So we're all tempted to kind of provide huge amounts of information in space, but that can become really, really overwhelming. So again, kind of thinking about paring things back so they're presented in a really understandable and simple way. So people, and if people want to find out more information, you can facilitate them to do that, but it can't be everything at once, because that can just become really overwhelming for people. And then we'll move on to this, which is where I kind of say the core of putting these principles into practice is when you kind of start a design process, the best thing to start with is user research. So finding out about what elements the people that you want to use whatever platform you have or what service you use, what are their needs, what are the barriers that they face, and that can be done in really simple ways. You know, quick surveys, having a conversation with them. There's lots of additional information on kind of people's data use and things like that. Ask around, you know, ask organizations that do a similar thing to you what their experiences are. So you're just kind of gathering that information as much as possible. And then we kind of suggest that when you kind of design things, do it in a co-production way. So that very much having the user in the room when you do the design, so they can kind of pick up on things that you might not have thought about, and it can be a really empowering process for them as well. And kind of once you go through that, the next stage is very much doing the user testing. So once you've come up, you know, you've made your decisions, you've gone, okay, this is what we're going to do. Test it out. This doesn't have to be, you know, a huge evaluation of hundreds of people. It can just be talking to like 3 to 5 people, checking things work. Does that button make sense to you? Does that, you know, is that confusing? Is that thing? And kind of start from that place. And then it feeds back into that loop. So you do that at every single stage of your design process, from your initial idea to when you kind of do your first test or pilot, and then you kind of refine as you go along. And that process can be ongoing. You know, we definitely find that you know, you're never going to have a perfect tool. It doesn't work like that. Actually, the important thing is thinking about it always being evolving, and you can always kind of tweak and change it and you can always test it. And if it doesn't work, that doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just might need to be changed in a slightly way. So again, having the confidence to go, it doesn't, you know, if you get a slight criticism, well, the color wasn't quite right for me because of X, Y, and Z. Okay, you can go back and change the color and just be quite flexible and adaptive to it. So, designing for safety. So when you're creating a new, as I said, sort of when you create a new service, iteration is really the key here. So kind of taking it in small chunks, testing as you go. Don't kind of embark on a huge big project where there's no kind of ability to kind of pivot or change your mind as you go through. So this is, again, kind of looking as much as kind of universal issues as much as possible, but there's also additional information in DigiSafe and the resource pack that can provide you kind of links and additional information. So the first thing we always talk about is the fact that digital can be used as part of abuse in lots of different ways. And that really has to be kind of in the forefront of your mind when you're designing anything and you're thinking about the risks. How could someone use this to cause harm or create additional harm to people? And as you can kind of see from our survey, when we talk about domestic abuse and gender-based violence, you can see more than, 54% of people said that, tech was used to help the perpetrator use tech as part of the abuse. As I said, there's so many different ways this can happen. It might be constant checking, making malicious comments, blackmailing, threatening to share images, but also kind of more sophisticated measures such as, putting trackers on people's phones, hacking into them, changing passwords. And one thing is not, so again, sometimes thinking about what tech, actual physical hardware is being used and having the conversations with your beneficiaries about what safety measures they could put in place. So, think about things like Alexa, smart cameras that used as baby monitors. Have you put in passwords in those sort of things? How's that been done? If they're using their mobile phone, is there particular times that they should only be using it? When they can send messages, all of those things. And as much as possible, just have those conversations before with your users and try and put in measures in place to make it as safe as possible. So like one of the things we say, a quick exit button on all your digital tools, a safe word if you're doing a Zoom call, if someone says something to you, just shut it down straight away. Things like that you can kind of put those measures in place beforehand, so you're kind of thinking through those risks. So again, we have to think about them for each individual platform. So we kind of put this graph together to kind of give you a kind of idea around that interactivity and the content and things. So you kind of think of the difference between a website where actually you kind of provide the information, you put it out there and it's quite static. There's not that much interaction, both in terms of the organization and the individual. And then you kind of go on to things like group work. If you set up a group session on Zoom, there's a lot of interactivity. There's a lot more kind of risks of disclosures. There's more things that you might need to do in terms of prevention beforehand, and also thinking about how you can check in on people at the end. So again, there's lots of information out there about these individual ones, so I'm not going to kind of go through them. There are sections. I'm going to go through the main ones here. So the first one we'll look at is kind of key risks around video-based services. So very much we're thinking about the kind of Zooms and Teams of the world, and these kind of apply whether you're doing it's like one-to-one sessions or as kind of wider group sessions. So the risks are, what's the risk of having poor quality phone, video or connection? So very much thinking about people's internet access online and what you could do to kind of support them. So whether it's kind of paying for data or providing mobile phones that can be used as hotspots or dongles, or is there certain places they could go to have better connections? Inadequate security sessions. So again, making sure that you kind of give people confidence. You go onto a Zoom call, depending on what you're doing it to. Does it need a password? Are you asking your participants to put their names, or is it just their first names or the second one? So just thinking about the context that you're working in and putting those in place. Again, having those conversations about how you create a safe space that they can interact on that digital call beforehand. So, whether, for instance, it might be that actually asking them to do it from home might just not feel safe and confidential at all. So you might suggest, well, do you have access to a car? You can sit and do the call in your car, or is there a specific room in the house that you could do it? So again, having those conversations beforehand can really boost people's confidence and their safety when actually participating in it. People can visibly look uncomfortable in calls. So again, making sure that you have a system in place, to what would you do if you felt like someone's uncomfortable. So maybe having a second member of staff on the call that can take someone out into the broken and have those conversations. What happens if someone leaves the room? Those sort of things. Again, very much these ones that Zoom calls can be very, very overwhelming. You've got, depending on, again, thinking about those dynamics, how many people you want to call, do you want to use kind of smaller sessions? So again, having those conversations beforehand can be really important. And again, thinking about the actual tech. So how comfortable are they using the different features? So if you're asking them to use a chat function, have they got an opportunity to test that out beforehand so they can kind of feel really confident, so they don't get overwhelmed within that context. And then lastly, which is really, really important, is what happens if someone makes a disclosure. So again, you kind of think about, what does the facilitator do? Do they have a template that they can write the information down? What are the pathways for them to escalate this? And also kind of making sure that they've been trained and have the confidence to reassure that person and to kind of do it in the safest way possible. Okay, going on to the next one. So again, this is kind of message-based systems. So you're thinking about sort of WhatsApp or Slack or kind of chat functions. So again, the first one to think of is just thinking about the security. So thinking that like WhatsApp, it's end-to-end encryption. So it's actually quite safe to use in terms of the only people that can access it are the people sending the message and the person receiving the message. But again, thinking about what we were talking about before, about how people kind of can facilitate abuse using tech. Is it possible that someone's checking the messages? Is it, those sort of things. And then thinking about the software I want to use, what kind of security features they have. Can someone kind of enter that chat? Do you have a moderation? All of those sort of things come into play here. And then you also need to think about kind of how it could be misused. What would, I always say it's always a really good way to start. What is the worst case scenario, and plan forward for that? So let's say in a messaging board that someone takes over it and it just puts highly abusive messages on something. So, the first step of that is having a moderation. So again, and then you can block, have you got the ability to block them from a service so that if they do behave inappropriately, you can do that. So again, it's just really thinking through the possibilities that you're dealing with. And again, so going on to the next one. So these are kind of live chats and chatbots. So again, a bit different from the message boards, which is a more kind of static process. So one of the key things here is that could it be read by others or shared without permission? So again, thinking about what security measures you're putting in place. Thinking about especially chatbots that are kind of designed to learn as they go. Is there risk of people getting wrong information? So if someone gets information that's not actually appropriate, how would you deal with that? Is there a particular thing that you need to kind of train that chatbot to have, a universal and here's a signposting thing? Again, if you're using things like chatbots, what are the risks around what would happen, and what's the kind of element of harm around them not identifying safeguarding risks? These things can only go so far, and they can be really sophisticated. But again, you just need to think those through. What measures can you put in place to do that? And again, thinking about the communication style. So what language are you using, especially if you're using things like chatbots or you're using scripts within your live chat? How can you make it feel more personalized, that they're not speaking to a machine, so it doesn't feel kind of distressing that they're kind of hitting the head in that way. So again, really importantly to think about, again, putting your user and testing it out with them, that the language is right and what the responses are. again, it can be really complex, and again, making sure that you have these conversations with your staff, especially if they're using kind of live chat functions, that they're really trained and they feel really confident as well. So the last one is sort of online groups and forums. So it might be that you've set up like things like a Facebook group, or you have a forum that's kind of a peer support forum on your website. So one of the kind of main risks is that in that context, people overshare. So what kind of rules have you put in place? What guidance have you given people about doing that? And if they do overshare, what do you do about it? So again, just making sure you've kind of thought all of those things through. Again, disclosures. What would you do in that context? What's appropriate for you to do in that context? Because it might be that you're kind of part of a Facebook group. So it might be that you can kind of message them privately and say, hey, have you looked at this? You know, have you thought about calling the police? Or here's some signposting information. Because you have lack of control in those senses, again, thinking about moderation. How are you going to make sure the content isn't triggering, especially if you're kind of doing peer work where people might be disclosing, and if they are triggered, what kind of advice and say and signposting you can give to people. And again, guidance at the top, you know, you can take a break, you know, if anything triggers, make sure that you kind of put those things in place. Again, we kind of go back to the anonymity issue. And the other one is very much thinking about fake profiles and kind of catfishing. If people are actively kind of pretending to do something, how you can kind of make checks. So it might be that, you know, things that if you have a private Facebook group, you do a bit of due diligence beforehand so that, you know, everyone can feel confident of who is in that space. And lastly, kind of inappropriate context. So we go back to, you know, what happens if people provide information and then kind of try and facilitate abuse in those spaces. And again, it's just about mitigating those risks. None of these things are supposed to be here to kind of prevent you from doing it. It's just about making sure you kind of think them through beforehand, so you're confident that if something happens, you know what to do. So lastly, just some additional things to consider. And again, we know that people are using a lot of digital support out there. Last survey we did as part of our Tech for Good project, we found that, you know, 65% of people were already just looking for support online, and most of the time they're just Googling it. So it's not something that isn't there, that isn't happening. So it's something that we kind of need to feel confident about, so we can do it as much as possible. And, you know, there's lots of different resources out there, you know, whether it's kind of, you know, mental health apps to, you know, live chats to just, you know, resources and guidance. So again, you know, this is really about kind of making you feel confident in when you kind of embark on providing things digitally. So the first thing to remember is to be transparent and accountable, and remember to collect all evidence. So again, whether you're doing your policy, when you start your policy, you're writing down your rationale, same when you're doing your risk assessment matrix, and you're very clear about how often you do it, to whether there's an incident. So again, it's kind of just important to keep that in mind, and being very kind of clear with anyone that's using any of your products what the process is as well. And the last one is just remembering that, you know, any safeguarding concerns can, you know, be very, very different and very, very dependent on the circumstances they're in. And so your team or your individual really does have to look at each case individually. And it might be that they want to then do a little bit kind of more investigative work. It might be they kind of make a decision that actually this is quite a low risk, and so we're just going to tweak our mitigation. So all of that has to be taken into context that each situation is individual. Just a quick kind of overview of some of the kind of current problems that people kind of think about in the current tech solutions. So one of the biggest barriers is whether they're free or not, issues of trolling, the information they get is quite generic, so it doesn't kind of fit their individual circumstances. So again, if you're providing specialty service, be proud of that. You don't necessarily have to code for everyone, but you know your users and your beneficiaries as really well. So again, make sure that it's kind of relevant to them. it doesn't give them exactly what they need. Sometimes it can be really hard to find, especially if you're in a situation where you've got to find that information quickly. So again, thinking about that when you do the design process, that you're kind of going through it, how quickly is it to find the relevant information, how responsive things are. People find adverts very off-putting. Again, what I would always say with this is that, you know, and we've definitely learned this over the last year, that, you know, technology does have its limitation. It's not going to replace, you know, every human contact that we have. So again, quite a lot of the time, it's really good to think about any kind of digital work that you do, that it's supplementary to other work that you're doing, so that they kind of complement each other. And yeah, that Facebook groups and kind of doing things online can be quite hard to follow. And again, there's kind of issues of anonymity, and people aren't sure about who they're talking to. And again, the last one is very much, again, about that kind of being quite simple around the language you use and things like that, and how much information, the kind of less is more approach. And again, I've kind of made this really clear at the bottom of the thing, that the best way to make sure that whatever you come up with has avoided as many problems as it can is just to test it with your users, get feedback and adapt as to what information they give you. As we kind of discussed before, responding to disclosures is really something you need to kind of think through in whatever digital tool or resources that you have, and it needs to be quite clear within your policy, you know, what is the process, and making sure that all your staff are really clear and have an understanding about it, and that you have to have different processes in different circumstances. So, you know, if someone disclosed something on a web chat, the response and how you deal with it is going to be very different, for instance, if they do it in the middle of a group work on Zoom. So again, it's just kind of thinking about if there's disclosures in different settings, and also making sure that your staff feel confident and aware of it. And again, what support they need to do it. So training and upskilling them is something that is really important to consider. Which leads nicely on to my last slide here. So it's been quite a whistle on tour here, which is really looking at kind of secondary trauma and resilience of your staff. So a lot of the time we think about safeguarding around our beneficiaries, but we don't necessarily think about it around our staff, and it's something that we really need to consider. You know, a lot of people have found kind of working online really difficult over the last year, especially if you're kind of delivering that frontline support. The dynamics a bit have changed. So again, really thinking about what kind of support you give your staff. You know, we really suggest things like clinical supervision, making sure that each individual staff has check-ins and check-outs. You know, if you know that they're going to do a group session, for instance, make sure that they've got space afterwards to unload or do things like that. So it's really thinking about not just your beneficiaries' well-being, but also your staff well-being. So yes, that is our whistle-stop step-by-step tour to digital safeguarding. So now I'm going to open the floor to questions. I see I already have one, so I will start with that, and I will try to get through them as quickly as possible. What I suggest, if you have specific questions, if you could put them in the Q&A, that would be great. If they are, if they're just sort of general comments and things, it's great if you can keep them in the chat. So the first question, so in line with their safeguarding policy, they don't engage with young people on any platform other than work email, but this does mean we struggle sometimes to engage, especially with like difficult to reach children, and we cannot use WhatsApp, Zooms or Telegram. Do you have any guidance and recommendations on alternative methods that are more suitable, or any guidance on whether there's a blanket ban or it really is the safest option? So yeah, there are kind of more issues that you need to think about regarding children. So again, thinking about the consent element. So quite a lot of the time you need, children can't consent to being part of an online platform above under 13. So you can get consent from parents or trusted adults, but there also are some contexts where you're allowed, especially if you're providing counselling support, where you don't need to get it. Sorry, I'm really sorry. There is someone knocking at my door quite persistently. I will back in 2 seconds. I cannot apologise more. They can unfortunately see me, so they keep on knocking on my window.
Don't worry, Ava. While Ava's stepping away, I just want to remind everyone I did put it in the working from home live. I put it in the chat. People were asking about the resources that Ava referred to and the pre-videos as well. It's all in a blog, which is on the Beyond site. I'll put the link back into the chat so that you can see that after this call. But you'll also receive a follow-up email to this session, which will include a link to that recording, also a link to this recording, and you'll be able to download the PowerPoint as well. So you will get all this information in follow-up. And I'll hand back to you, Ava.
I'm so sorry, everyone, for that. I'm sure very persistent. So yes, going on to children. There isn't, you don't have to consider it as a blanket ban. You just need to consider what are the risks. So again, if you are dealing with children that have got, plans in place, again, kind of communicating with their social worker, whether that's appropriate or not, thinking about in those ways. So again, it's just kind of doing that due diligence beforehand and then making sure that you've got consent from all the kind of people going forward. Work emails are not necessarily what most children would use. But again, if you think about it, if you've got consent to contact them on work elements, you've probably got consent to talk to them on WhatsApp. It's just about making sure that you've got that consent in place beforehand. I hope that helps. So client use Facebook and other social media platforms that are outside our control, but put other clients at risk. Are useful guidance and frameworks to develop contracts around this? Do you add that? Do we just need to add them to our digital safeguarding project? Absolutely. This is something that we probably all struggle with, where we don't have any control over how people communicate on social media, and it can be sometimes quite a toxic environment, whilst it can have lots of benefits as well. So again, just outlining what you expect from them and code of conducts beforehand, really, really helpful, and just embed that within your safeguarding policy. Again, it's about holding and mitigating those risks. You're never going to be able to get rid of them. Again, it's just making sure you know what you're going to do. So yes, do we have any links and guidance on children's support under 13 and consent receiving trauma support? Yes, within the resource pack, there's some specific links around children. And again, one of the things I would definitely suggest you do is go onto the Information Commissioner's website, where there's some really quite in-depth guidance around working with children and data protection, and kind of those sort of things. So again, looking at the legislation around that, there's some really, really clear guidance. And again, they kind of point out when you need consent and when you don't, and when you need a DPA and stuff like that. Next question. So I'm rushing through these, I apologise. For assessing risks, would you advise having a separate safeguarding risk document or integrate it into your health and safety risk assessment? Or your DPA log, depending on the project? I would suggest having a separate document when you're talking about risk assessment. So again, that when you're talking about safeguarding risk, so you're kind of separating it out from some of the kind of health and safety ones. So it's just really clear and transparent what you're talking about, because the way you think about it is slightly differently in terms of mitigation. Again, it's really good to link that to your individual projects. So again, best practice is having something that's quite overarching for your organization when you're talking about safeguarding risks, and then you probably also need to do them on an individual project basis. Again, having 2 separate documents, but again, linking them so people can find that additional information is probably the best way of going about it. Those are all my questions for the moment. I'm gonna, yep, those are all my questions for the moment. I'll have a quick look on chat.
Thanks, Ava. Shall I just run through what's coming up?
Yeah, that would be great.
If any more questions come in, we've got a bit more time. I think it's, yeah, on the next slide.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
There you are.
So we've actually got some Q&A, what we're calling Q&A huddles coming up at the end of April. So we realize that what's been covered today is a lot of information. So if, as you start to kind of assess what you've got in place and make changes, you've got some specific questions that crop up, then Ava is joining us for this huddle for both of them, and also Hira from Chain, the organisation some of you may know. So they'll be there to answer any specific questions that you might have related to your particular safeguarding journey. On Beyond as well, and I think it might be on the next slide as well, if I remembered to add it. We've got a number of other related training courses which you might be interested in. So one is this cybersecurity training, which starts with a self-led online learning module, which should take a maximum of 2 hours, and that you can do in like a number of sittings or do it all at once. And then we've got an interactive webinar, which is on the 23rd of March. I think this is quite relevant to the topics that we've covered today, because it helps you make sure that the tools that you're using are set up in a way to sort of keep them safe, keep your service users safe, but also build your confidence in actually kind of managing those tools and dealing with a situation if you were to encounter a breach of security of your tools. So I definitely recommend looking at that one. And we're also running a data protection course, which I don't think I included actually in here, but you'll find it on the Beyond website. And that's helpful as well if you need to assess any kind of data protection or privacy policies in line with GDPR, as again, you kind of start to assess the holistic kind of needs around safeguarding. We also have another survey for you, which I'm going to put into the chat now. And this is just a post survey to cover what we've covered in today's session. You don't need to complete it now, because I appreciate that you might need a little bit of time to just digest everything that's been covered. But if you do want to complete it now, we welcome you to do that. You'll also receive this in an email as well. I think that's it from me. I'll just put this into the chat. Do you see any more questions, Ava?
I think there's been a couple of questions just looking through the chat. I know you answered it again, but I think just kind of going back to a DPIA. Sorry. DPIA. So that stands for a data protection impact assessment. So what these are is under specific projects, especially if you're working with children, but also if you're working with vulnerable adults, if you're kind of carrying out a project where you'll be collecting a lot of people's personal data, under GDPR laws, you're required to do a data protection assessment. So that would be really looking at the kind of really in-depth stuff around security and privacy. So again, it's kind of setting that out within a written document in the matrix. If you go onto the Information Commissioner's website, again, they have lots of guidance around how you kind of go about them and also what circumstances you absolutely need to do them. But what I would say is that quite a lot of the time, they're really useful anyway to do them when you're kind of starting up projects. So kind of worth the time if you can. And great. So yeah, I think that's everything. So thank you everyone for your time today. I know it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I hope that was useful for everyone. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks for joining, everyone. Look out for the blog and we'll share all the information that was covered today. Have a good day.